back. This is a survival horror game after all. Not fighting back means Isaac Clarke getting horrifically slaughtered in gory detail, with more variations to his death than I could even cover in this video. But progressing in the game means killing the monsters. You start to beat them, and you get better at it, and over hours and hours of gameplay and countless necromorphs just barely dismembered before they do the same to you, you eventually stop being so afraid of them. The same group of enemies that's thrown at you at the beginning of this game, presented as this unstoppable threat, well, by the end, you're mowing them down like they owe you money, or ammo, or whatever you can stomp out of their corpses. And not only that, but the intro section of Dead Space thrives on a fear of the unknown. These creatures are just thrown at you without any idea of what they are, or how they work, or really anything other than that they'll kill you if you let them get too close. It makes the first few hours, even after the opening, incredibly tense because you don't know what they're capable of or what to expect. All you do know is that they can come out of any vent or be any suspicious looking body on the ground, but you never know which ones, so you never feel safe. But through the natural course of the plot, you start to get answers. You learn the creatures' names, you learn what they are, you learn the best way to deal with them. You become familiar, which again removes some part of the fear, because something creeping about in the dark is less scary when you know how to kill it. So when Isaac Clarke survives his trip to the Ishimura and makes it to Dead Space 2, there is this massive problem. A problem inherent to every horror sequel. By playing the game, you've grown more confident, you've grown more knowledgeable, and the same enemies and scares won't get you a second time around, at least not as well. So how can the sequel possibly scare you? Dead Space 2 opens in a similar over-the-shoulder way as the first game, this time with Isaac being in an insane asylum for reasons that really don't matter. He's given exposition in the form of an interrogation, catching the player up to speed on what happened in the first game, including a spooky hallucination to demonstrate Isaac's poor mental state. And then a new character breaks Isaac out. His name is Franco. He was actually a main character in the prequel game Dead Space 2. The opening of the second game is very well done, and obviously mirrors the first game's chase sequence closely, though I think the differences in the intros highlights the difference in the two games very well. In Dead Space 1, you have 10 minutes of building tension into the horror set piece that kicks things off. There's this sense of dread and not knowing what's going to happen, so when the chase finally starts, it's a mad panic that's only been built up more in your mind. In Dead Space 2, the game jumps straight into the horror in half the time, and this time in much more gory detail. Franco's sudden death is a supremely brutal piece of imagery that I'm sure sticks with anyone who sees it. Even the chase scene is more chaotic, more detailed, and more violent than the first game. But it's that brutality in exchange for slow tension that Dead Space 2 does so well. It knows it can't build a mystery or a feeling of uncertainty because you've already played the first game. You know what's going to inevitably happen. So instead, it just jumps straight into the action, and it amps it up to a freshly uncomfortable new limit. It takes everything that might not scare you from the first game and pushes it as far as it can until it scares you again. And that's the sort of design philosophy that the second game adheres to in every aspect. Combat is faster, enemies are more vicious, the set pieces are so insane and graphic and disturbing that even having the confidence of the first game, you still won't feel comfortable playing them. I mean, I don't think there's an amount of times I could play this game that would ever have me feeling alright during this scene. And that's sort of the best attempt you could possibly make for a horror sequel. Something won't scare you the same way twice, so do something different and crazier to get a new scare. And it's why Dead Space 2 competes right along with 1 when talking about the best horror games of all time. But of course, even all that being said, Dead Space 2 runs into the same problem. Dead Space 1 already ramped up the action and took away the suspense. Dead Space 2 takes this even further, with bigger bosses and bombastic horror, and it desensitizes you even more to everything that's happened. So what else could possibly scare you a third time around? And, as it turns out, not much. I'm not even gonna bait you into a jump scare this time. Dead Space 3 doesn't even really have it. I mean, this is the big jump scare moment that opens the third game. That's just kinda sad, especially when it comes after walking in the snow for a couple minutes as our new protagonist, who isn't Isaac Clarke, and then after that, you just fight these Call of Duty zombie-looking motherfuckers before someone doing a Michael Ironside impersonation blows your head off. All of which is to say, not as great an opening as the first two games, or even an attempt at anything horror, really. Because again, the opening of the games is sort of indicative of the direction they try to head. Dead Space 1 is tension and suspense. Dead Space 2 is brutality and spectacle. Dead Space 3 is action and cinematics. The game makes fundamental changes to the formula even greater than what Dead Space 2 hinted at. It's now a co-op game, with Isaac receiving some military dude as his partner. It is much faster paced, with tons more regular enemies and bigger bosses, and those enemies aren't even mainly necromorphs anymore, but these strange zombies mixed in with regular gun-wielding humans. Dead Space 3's story and pacing have also completely shifted. Gone are any unknown elements to the story, gone is the loneliness and tension from walking the levels, gone is any buildup of horror. You're never really placed into situations meant to scare you, since the addition of a partner would deflate that tension anyway. Co-op games are just inherently less scary, so lots of the game is built around just mowing your way through swarms of enemies instead. And because of the now expanded cast of characters, the story is much more direct and explained. The game is just all action and exposition and dialogue all of the time. Now, this is still following that progression of Dead Space 1 to 2 to now 3 in its final form, but it also might be a bit strange, or more accurately, like it's trying to become a different game and not just expanding on the previous one. And that's because it is. To give some context, Dead Space 1 was famously inspired by Resident Evil 4. The designers of Dead Space even have direct quotes where they say the game is explicitly a mix between Resident Evil 4 and System Shock, because they like those games so much. And so it should come as no surprise that when Resident Evil 5 and 6 came out, it had an obvious effect on the development of the Dead Space franchise. Just looking at gameplay from RE6 and Dead Space 3 next to each other, it should hopefully make a lot more sense why some of these design decisions were made. Co-op, faster gameplay, more dialogue and cutscenes, a bigger focus on action spectacle, zombies. All of this being put into Dead Space 3 was a direct consequence of trying to be like Resident Evil. However, the reason for these changes is actually a lot more insidious than you might think. But before we talk about that, let's actually cover Resident Evil. Now, Resident Evil might be the singular most influential horror franchise in the world. It's completely shaped the games industry, especially horror games, and even stretched outside to movies and TV to varying levels of success.
This is borderline experimental. This makes no sense at all. What's happening?
But to not cover it in a video about horror series that get less scary would be a crime, because it's done it 3 fucking times. The series essentially fits into 3 distinct trilogies, where every 3 games or so, the franchise shifts dramatically into a different type of horror action game. And by or so, I mean there's more Resident Evil games I haven't played than ones I have. Like, just look at this timeline of releases, it's ridiculous, but the main games are the only ones I'll care about here. Though if you prefer a thorough look at Resident Evil, I'd highly recommend Noah Caldwell-Gervais' video on the series. It runs pretty short, at 7.5 hours long, so just go watch all of that if you need some more context. Resident Evil 1, very similar to Alone in the Dark, is a very focused horror title. However, unlike Alone in the Dark, I will give Capcom credit for only naming one of the games just Resident Evil. And as nerds on the internet like me always point out, the game was made initially as a remake of Sweet Home on the NES, and developed into a zombie game by Takura Fujiwara, Sweet Home's original creator, before passing the torch to Shinji Mikami. And this passing of the torch was done for one very explicit reason. Shinji Mikami hated being scared. Up until that point, Mikami had worked on making the Disney Aladdin game as well as Goof Troop and had almost no experience with scary media. So Fujiwara greenlit him as director because, quote, Mikami hated it. This is how our conversation went. You hate being scared? Yep. So I figured we should do it. If he'd answered that he never got scared, I couldn't have trusted him with the project. People who aren't afraid of anything don't understand what's frightening. In my view, you can't make a horror game if you don't have any fear. And that last line of Fujiwara's quote, I think, is the key to not only the Resident Evil franchise, but the answer to why horror games stop being scary in general. Because that fear he talks about is exactly what Mikami used to make the game, and it permeates throughout the entire thing, from the design of the enemies, to the layout of the mansion, to the fucking dogs. Resident Evil is a scary game made by someone trying to scare himself. It's a game that could only be made by someone who could be afraid of it. Going into Resident Evil 2 and 3, however, you can start to see that fear dissipate, because development of Resident Evil 2 actually started with Shinji Mikami having creative differences with the new director, Hideki Kamiya. Mikami actually only stayed around as a producer to see the game's progress once a month. The game also restarted development 80% of the way through, completely rewriting the plot and characters with a bigger focus on action and appealing to a wider audience, which will sound very familiar in a moment, so keep that in mind. Resident Evil 3 also started as a side project by a completely inexperienced team that got promoted to a mainline title, and funnily enough, that will also sound very familiar in a bit. Now, I won't recap all of the same ideas I covered with Dead Space 2 and 3, but the principle of expanding the games is exactly what happened with Resident Evil 2 and 3. The games have more intensity and faster pacing, trading off tension for thrills. Resident Evil 2 even introduces Mr. X, an unkillable enemy that chases you around to keep the game moving. And Resident Evil 3 upgrades this enemy to the Nemesis, and has the whole game revolve around him chasing you. Each game also has more zombies, more weapons, and more cinematic action moments. Just the same as the Dead Space franchise, the game's focus shifted away from pure horror. Oh, and Resident Evil 2 also had a live-action trailer directed by George Romero. That's not an important piece of information, I just think it's fun. But while Resident Evil 2 and 3 were financially and critically successful, the team had to face that old problem of familiarity. They felt constrained by the limits of the game, and as such, it became much harder to make something scary within those limits. So with the development of Resident Evil 4, they scrapped pretty much everything. Starting development while RE3 was still being made, the game implemented a then brand new dynamic camera system. And story-wise, they also focused on more stylish action, whatever that means. The game would also feature an invincible man with skills and intellect, and superhuman abilities, and his name would be Tony. Oh yeah, so that version of Resident Evil 4 was actually completely rejected by Shinji Mikami, who sent Hideki Kamiya off to go develop it into its own game. This little project called Devil May Cry. Probably nothing important. And then Mikami went on to make a much more grounded game with Resident Evil 4, where you're hired by the president to go around suplexing zombies. To say RE4 was a groundbreaking game would be an understatement. It is one of the most critically acclaimed and referenced video games of all time. Just look at any video by Jacob Geller to hear about how great it is. He made a video about Dead Space 2. God damn. But while Resident Evil 4 is a revolutionary horror game, it does have a very strange idea of horror. As someone who didn't play the game when it came out, this is where I'll admit that I might just be a cynic. It's hard to rate the game properly when so many others, including Dead Space, have come out since with the sole intention of being Resident Evil 4 but better. It's like going back and watching an old black and white movie. I know Citizen Kane is a technical masterpiece, but it doesn't stop it from being so boring that Orson Welles spliced in a cockatoo squawking to wake the audience up. That's a true fact, by the way, look it up. And Resident Evil's cockatoo moment is surely anytime Leon roundhouse kicks a zombie in the head, or does front flips over laser beams, or speaks.
I have been honored with a prodigious power from the great Lord Saturn. I've been expecting you, my friend.
No thanks.
Because while the horror is still certainly there, and RE4 is by all means a scary game a lot of the time, there is still a certain layer of camp that is impossible to remove. And don't get me wrong, Resident Evil always had camp. The original voice actors for Resident Evil 1 still deliver some of the most unintentionally funny lines in gaming.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you. That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
But RE4's upgrade from 3 in nearly every conceivable way does not, for some reason, include an upgrade in tone. It's more visceral, more interactive, and yet still just as cheesy. However, that cheese does not become a real problem until Resident Evil 5, which seemed to latch onto that part particularly hard. Harder than Chris Redfield sucker punched that piece of volcano. Because with the massive success of Resident Evil 4, I think Capcom started getting a glimmer in their eye. One that told them the campiness and action elements of Resident Evil 4 were working, and one that told them action had a much broader appeal than horror. And so Resident Evil 5 is barely even trying to be a horror game. It isn't trying to scare you. So first of all, RE5 was completely redesigned around co-op, and I'd say just like Dead Space 3, but actually it would be the other way around, which again makes it much less scary. They also made the baffling decision to swap out the dark hallways and gothic nighttime environments for midday Africa, which is insane, not only for the obvious racist implications, but because if you asked me to think of the least scary ambience possible, bright-ass African sunlight would probably be top of the list. And to cap it all off, the game's new director, Jun Takeuchi, said their main inspiration for the game was Black Hawk Down. Just to confirm, yes, the game had yet another new director, and yes, he said that he modeled the game after a war movie. And so now, those action elements that the series has been ramping up for more than 4 games finally cultivates in a third-person shooter more akin to Gears of War, where at the end, Chris Redfield haymakers a giant rock. Actually, let me give some context. The end of the game has Chris Redfield and Shiva, his co-op partner, fighting a super mutant Albert Wesker inside an active volcano where Chris Redfield must perform body blows on a big boulder to move it out of his way. There is no defense for this. There is no possible interpretation of the game as horror at this point. It is completely distant from a scary experience. And not only that, but the very next game, Resident Evil 6, opens with Leon Kennedy having to shoot his best friend, the President of the United States, in the head after he turns into a zombie.
Mr. President!
It might create more problems. It's time we take responsibility. We want to have any change. Always valued your friendship, Leon. Do this.
That is how Resident Evil 6 opens. It also features a scene where a tank chases you through a giant mansion and you escape it by riding away on a motorcycle, which eventually leads to jumping that same motorcycle over a helicopter.
Here we go! Hold on!
And all of that is somehow on par with the tone of the whole game. Resident Evil is unashamedly a cheesy action franchise at this point. It delights in the stupidity and spectacle of it all. Resident Evil 6 not only has 4 different campaigns featuring nearly every character in the series so far, except for the one black person, but it also has multiple boss fights with ridiculously large monsters that you replay multiple times across the same game. Resident Evil 6 just revels in its own excess too much to be enjoyable, or scary, which unsurprisingly was the critical consensus of the game. Resident Evil 6 was the first game in the franchise to receive less than positive reviews, and though the excess in the game was driven from a desire to expand to a bigger audience, people just did not like it. So Resident Evil, at the height of its popularity, died a death of its own making, one brought on by greed and hubris. However, it was already too late. The franchise was so big at this point that even the shitty live-action movies were financially successful. And with only this last game being a flop, you can bet every other game studio wanted to try and take its place. So this is where we come back to Dead Space 3, with the full context that Resident Evil 5 and 6 had just made a boatload of cash with their complete disregard for horror. And what a coincidence, Dead Space 2, for as beloved as it now is, didn't make as much money as EA wanted it to. So Dead Space 3 was almost cancelled because of this, until conveniently after the release of Resident Evil 6, when it was reworked and remade into a co-op shooter against zombie enemies with a focus on action over horror. The game was also shoved full of microtransactions, such as rechargeable loot Roombas, in an attempt to make more money. Even the decision to make the game co-op came so late in development that the team had to scrap and rebalance all the enemies just to avoid breaking the difficulty. And Isaac's partner, being a generic military grunt, was done solely because an executive at EA thought that soldiers were cool at the time. Now, Visceral Games would never explicitly say they were forced into abandoning their creative agency so they wouldn't lose their jobs. But due to the fact that they all lost their jobs when the studio was closed down sometime later, I can't help but think that that's what happened. And that's sort of where the discussion of Dead Space 3 ends. I won't even bother trying to bring up its merits or give it a good faith argument because it clearly wasn't made in good faith. And, well, speaking of, Fear was an action horror game developed by Monolith Productions in 2005 and published by Vivendi Games. As a first-person shooter with strong horror elements, drawing inspiration from both John Woo films and Japanese horror movies simultaneously, it was an interesting blend of ideas, and also an unprecedented success. This is in no small part due to the sheer talent of the developers. For example, the AI in the game had adaptive goal planning that reacted to the player's actions and formed plans to stop them, even giving out callouts and orders between NPCs. This AI was so complicated because it was developed by an AI engineer with a PhD from MIT, who later went on to work on the same type of chatbot that a Google employee fell in love with because they thought it was sentient. Now, I won't go far into the rest of the gameplay of Fear, since it's the series I'm by far the least familiar with. There are plenty of other videos talking about the achievements of the game, including one by Patrician TV that I'll link below because it directly inspired me to talk about the series in this video. But what I want to cover is the development history, which is almost more interesting than the games themselves, and almost surely to sound familiar to you if you've been paying attention so far. So while in production with Vivendi, Monolith Productions was actually acquired by Warner Brothers, since Vivendi also owned Blizzard and didn't really give a shit about anything other than World of Warcraft at the time. And this leads to one of the most insane development struggles ever, one so complicated that there's entire flowcharts explaining the situation. Basically, Vivendi and Monolith both owned partial rights to Fear after the split. So Monolith began working on Fear 2 under Warner Brothers, and Vivendi contracted Day One Studios, the developers that ported the original Fear to console, to develop another Fear 2 at the exact same time. So Monolith's Fear 2 ended up coming out first, becoming the official Fear 2. And shortly after, Warner Brothers won the full rights to the franchise and then decided to have Day One Studios rebuild their Fear 2 into Fear 3. So basically, to summarize, Fear 3 was developed by a completely different, inexperienced studio and upgraded to a main game. I told you it would sound familiar. Fear 3 also had a bunch of insane development struggles on its own, like how they hired John Carpenter to work on cinematics for the game, and apparently he did absolutely nothing but collect a paycheck and never actually met a single member of the team, which might be the most John Carpenter thing he could have done. Warner Brothers also brought in comic writer Steve Niles to write the story, entirely against the developers' wishes, and Niles wrote the whole script in movie screenplay format, which, if you didn't know, isn't how fucking video games work. And so Day One had to rewrite basically everything they were given from him. But the most important development struggle isn't even any of that. The biggest change in the development of the game came from Warner Brothers themselves, who had the team completely change the horror-focused elements of the series into action and adventure. According to Day One, the president of Warner Brothers had recently gotten into Call of Duty and wanted to make the franchise more like that. And this is a direct quote from the game's lead artist. We started getting notes from Warner saying, "We really need epic moments. We want big, out-of-control, world-coming-to-an-end type stuff." We were really taken aback because that was not the game we were making. That completely changed the nature of the game, and hardcore fans will tell you right away, this was not a scary game. Warner Brothers also forced the game into having co-op, in an attempt to broaden the appeal, and, well, I hope you're seeing the pattern here. If I haven't made my opinion on co-op in horror games clear enough, here's a quote from the game's associate producer, Chris Julian. "We had got the word from Warner that co-op was hot, so we were making a co-op game. Our response was, co-op isn't frightening, co-op isn't scary when you're playing with somebody else. They didn't care because co-op was a buzzword in the industry at the time, and they demanded we make a co-op. So we had to go back and retool all the levels to make them co-op compatible." Man, doesn't that sound almost identical to what happened to Dead Space 3? Weird how the world works like that, huh? Oh, and that's not all. Speaking about the game's 4-year development period, level designer Matt Mason had this to say. "There were many, many months of unofficial crunch before the crunch became official, with staff being told they had to work longer hours. There were multiple occasions when staff members wouldn't go home for several days, instead sleeping on site." Referring back to the lead artist, the game had 44 milestones, each of which involved a degree of crunch, whilst the last crunch consisted of 8 months of 60 to 80-hour weeks. Multiple staff members quit during this period. Oh, and the happy ending to Day One Studios slaving away at a game to meet publishers' demands was 100 of their employees being laid off after the game came out due to a failed deal with Konami. The rest of the studio then got bought out by Wargaming and brought in as one of 14 studios working on the World of Tanks series. And that might honestly be the scariest thing I've talked about in this video. Yeah, you didn't think the real horror in the video would be real life, did you? The real jump scare is unemployment. Honestly, the similarities between Dead Space 3 and Fear 3 are staggering, as pretty much every development issue besides John Carpenter were shared by both games. And while Visceral employees would find other employment, and Monolith would go on to create Shadow of Mordor for Warner Brothers, effectively mitigating any chance either studio would speak up about the terrible publisher conditions, it seemed that Day One just didn't give a fuck. And so this one rare incident really helped shine a light on the horror games industry at large, and the terrible conditions many are forced to deal with. Because Fear and Dead Space and Resident Evil aren't even the only examples. Remember Alone in the Dark? The 2008 remake was developed by Eden Games, a studio that primarily developed racing games and was contracted to make a horror shooter by Atari. Which completely explains the weird driving segments in that game, by the way. But unfortunately, most of their company was laid off afterwards, forcing them to go on strike before liquidating and now working under a Chinese blockchain company. Even Silent Hill Downpour, which I briefly mentioned at the beginning of the video, was developed by Vatra Games, who had only made one game before and had their Silent Hill project start off as a spin-off before being upgraded to a mainline title. And like a lot of others, Vatra had their contract terminated immediately after Downpour's release and declared bankruptcy because of it. I feel like I'm repeating the same lines over and over again at this point. There's so many horror games that have gone through this exact process that I couldn't possibly talk about them all. It is insane. I mean, with these repeated patterns of horror titles being contracted out by inexperienced devs who get fired right after, is it any wonder none of them are scary? These games are made with as much passion as an Excel spreadsheet your boss asked for 10 minutes before you leave work. The only motivation is keeping your job. But that isn't necessarily the end for a lot of these games. There is some small light at the end of the tunnel, because while franchises like Resident Evil might be killed off by the action dumpster fire that was 6, there is a chance for it to come back from the dead. Resident Evil 7 is a staggering second attempt by Capcom to completely change the series' direction and gameplay style. And this game is honestly a marvel, because where Resident Evil 4 changed a lot from 3, 7 just feels like a completely different series at this point. A first-person survival horror game set in an old Louisiana farmhouse featuring an insane mutant family, Resident Evil 7 is one of the only games to compete with Resident Evil 1 for most horror-focused title in the series. And it definitely wins the title for scariest Resident Evil game, and maybe even the scariest game I've talked about so far. I don't know, let's compare a few scenes.